go for it. Welcome to the Bowden Education Podcast, where I get the opportunity to chat to amazing people who are making a positive and transformational impact within education. Our autumn series captures the work and experiences of a range of professionals and covers a wide variety of topics, from experiences of the ECT year through to establishing a brand new SEN provision and everything in between. Today, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to chat to Joanna Hinson about Forest School. Jo trained as a nursery nurse and worked in the NHS before moving into education in 1994, and then spent 7 years in nursery classes before helping to establish an early years unit and moving to work in reception. Jo's also worked in years 3 and 1, where she was part of a transition pilot project for Lewisham Education and was then on the steering group of this project as it was rolled out. But in 2013, Jo trained as a Forest School leader, and I think this has led to a significant sort of gear change in her career, and has become now one of 3 that delivered sessions to 2 nursery classes and 3 reception classes. Initially, Jo was in a dual role, classroom and Forest School based. Forest School was then extended to year 1 as part of their transition, and then Jo eventually managed to include year 2 as well. In 2019, Jo moved to Chartham Primary School in Kent as a dedicated Forest School leader, where she's extended the provision from 3 half classes a week for 1 term a year to all classes every week. And Jo increased the provision during COVID, and they've never looked back. Last year, the school trained 2 more members of staff as Forest School leaders. So now Jo is the Forest School lead for the, it's a small academy trust, isn't it, Jo, that you're a lead for? And the team are now delivering 14 sessions a week across 3 different sites that allows children access to varied environments. Jo's also the local assessor for those training with the FSLI to become a level 3 Forest School leader in Canterbury. So welcome, Jo. You're very, very busy. And I know hugely passionate about the benefits of Forest School, which is what we will explore as we chat today. But firstly, I've given you an introduction that kind of sketched your career, but if you could summarise your career to date, what would you say about your career?
I would think really it's the 4-letter word play that most places are very scared of, whether it's parents or teachers or educational departments. The word play is seen to be the opposite of work, and what you have to do in school is work, when in fact that's a total misnomer, because the opposite of working is being idle. So play is just a completely different form of work. Even as adults and professionals, people will be told to go play with an idea and come up with something. But we don't see it that way. We just think it's something that children shouldn't really be doing except as a leisure activity. And probably because of my founding in early years, I can see the benefit of it, and that benefit never disappears, even as us as adults. And I learn a huge amount from what you consider to be a leisure activity. And I think most people will agree that they've learned a lot more since they left school than they possibly learned in school, simply through their own interests, which you could deem as their playtime.
Yeah. But it's also interesting, and I was thinking as you were talking there, Jo, that quite often we see play as a thing that comes before learning starts.
Yes.
And that's so right, what you were saying. We go around and we use the terms play with an idea. And I think like you say, everyone learns through play, and let's remember that when we are happiest, we learn best.
Yes.
So let's allow ourselves to be happy and therefore better learners. So what then, you moved into education in 1994. So that's a good while ago now. So what drives and inspires you to work in education when we see so much reporting of how challenging working in education is and the dropout rate and so on?
I think one of the main things is it's a cycle, and whatever is fashionable now will go, and something else will come along, and that will go, and something else will come along. And if you hold tight, eventually the wheel turns and it comes back to the way that you prefer doing it. I don't think anybody is 100% happy in any job that they do all the time. You have good weeks, bad weeks, good days, bad days, good years, bad years. And I think the difficulty in education is so much of what you do is directed completely by somebody else. But I think for me, just that understanding, watching, probably because I started out in the NHS, I see very much education as hand in hand with development. And it is something that we continue to do throughout our lives. We never stay still biologically or physically or mentally. And I think I have the option, or I had the option of bowing out and leaving that to other people who don't fully get that, or to be involved with it and try and steer it so that the two complement each other rather than work against each other, which often sadly does happen in education, that the expectations are completely opposite to developmental milestones. And that's not just in early years, that works all the way through, including probably into adulthood.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why so many children, if you like, sort of fall out or fail, or the system fails them, because the system is at odds with what's best for that particular child. The system is designed around a very antiquated sort of factory line approach, but that's another conversation.
It is. But you see, we accept it a little bit with physical for children. We will accept that for a baby to learn to walk, that it might be really early to walk at 10 months, but that's perfectly normal. And it might be really late to not walk until you're 2, but that's also perfectly normal. And we'll accept that. But when it comes to milestones in education, it has to be bang on the dot of not even their age, but a date set in a calendar. And those children can be 11 months, 3 weeks apart in age, but the expectation is the same. And the clearest evidence of how ridiculous that is came to me when we had siblings, a brother and a sister, in the same year group who were born 11 months apart. They were not twins, but they were expected to be at exactly the same developmental stage throughout their entire school career, when from mum's point of view, this child is my eldest and this child is my youngest.
Yeah. And that's a great example, isn't it, of how the system needs a rethink. But for those listening, and we'll get on to Forest School. So that's important. So for those listening who maybe have heard of Forest School but haven't been involved in Forest School, could you explain sort of the concept, really?
Forest School is pretty much its own kind of pedagogy. It puts the child at the centre of their own learning. Everything we do is child-led. There is structure there, but the structure is in the routine and the expectations and the rules. When I say rules, that kind of sounds scary, but we have rules that are there for safety. So it's okay to climb a tree as long as you know the rules to do it safely. It's okay to play with sticks as long as you know the rules for doing it safely. It's okay to be outside, full stop, as long as you understand the rules to be safe. And that's how it's explained to the children, that it is to be safe. But within that structure, the children are allowed to follow their own interests and to follow it at their own pace. In order to work well, you need space, you need time, it needs repetition. So going to forest school once a year isn't really going to have much of an effect. It needs to be as regular as you can make it. And for some children, it will tap into well-being, mental health, and being outside. For some children, just removing the pressure of being in a classroom, having four walls, makes a big difference. But from their point of view, they have freedom, and a freedom to do what we are saying we like to do as adults, to just follow our own interests. And the reason it happens a lot in early years settings is because in early years, people are trained much better to notice and to see beyond what the children are doing. So, for instance, today, there was a group of about 8 year 3s in what we call the dig pit, which was partly covered in water today. And they were trying to join the puddles together to form a river to come down from the slightly higher ground. And there were so many puddles, they could build 3 rivers down to the same giant puddle at the bottom. And together, these children were planning and designing and troubleshooting and communicating and cooperating and collaborating. They were doing engineering, they were doing math estimations in their head, they were being polite to each other, they were kind of covering everything you could possibly want these children to do in a self-chosen activity that they were probably doing for an hour and a half. And nowhere else in the school curriculum is there the freedom or the opportunity to do something like that. And they all came away having achieved it, came away really happy, came away with a positive reinforcement of being at school, and being heard. And as I said, by being child-led, it makes whatever learning has gone on just that much more powerful for the children as well.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me on to what I was going to ask you next about, so why and how is forest school beneficial to children's learning? So you talked about that there's no space in the curriculum for making rivers down to your puddle and things like this. And for some, that's probably thinks, well, where does it fit? Why is it important? What impacts it actually going to have then?
When I used the word play earlier, which is definitely a 4-letter word and nobody likes to use it, I wrote on a blog last year that play is a 4-letter word for inquiring, exploring, inventing, communicating, imagining, improvising, constructing, and accomplishing self-chosen, self-motivated tasks. It's an informative, practical, valuable, and effective way to analyze, research, envision, improve, and understand the world. If you are teaching children to do that, or if you are giving them the opportunity to do that, most of the time that translates back to other tasks. So the children go back into the classroom knowing that they are capable of learning, they are capable of doing these things. It can change a mindset completely. It just that building of motivation and curiosity that forest school achieves most of the time, and I'm not going to say every single child it works on because I can't promise that, but the vast majority it does. It kind of, for want of a better phrase, makes them a better learner. They go back into a classroom ready to tackle something else, something that may be more difficult.
Yeah, so in a way builds resilience, but also develops those relationships in a different way of working together. So going back to your digging the rivers today, working with their classmates to do that, when actually in class they might find working with the same people much more difficult and awkward. So over
Yes.
time, I'm sure, and you talked about repetition, over time these relationships build, which then opens the doors to learning, doesn't it, surely?
It certainly does. And one of the things you find outside is that friendship groups alter. Because if I want to go and climb a tree, but my friend doesn't want to, there's always someone else that does. So I'd rather go with the person I don't usually play with and climb that tree than to hang around with my friend who just wants to look for bugs, and I don't want to do that at the moment. But it also changes that kind of hierarchy that you have in children's little social groups. And the child that may be the most popular because, for all different kinds of reasons within the classroom, maybe they're the one that's funniest, or maybe they're the one that you want to sit next to because they're cleverest, or it's just your next door neighbour. That hierarchy completely changes. And outside, you will often find that children who are not necessarily the most popular in their class, not unpopular, but not necessarily the child that gets invited to every party, suddenly comes into their own. And outside, they happen to know more about something or other, or they understand how to do something better. And the children suddenly flock towards that child, and it can just change the whole dynamic of a class very, very quickly. And I see it happen whether it's with year 1 or year 6. Everything kind of alters a little bit, and quite often TAs or teachers who come outside to support will say, this is an interesting group. These two over here don't usually play together, and look, they're cooperating and they're chatting away and they're doing really well. But where in the curriculum for the classroom, where in your literacy and your maths lessons are you going to have a chance to mix that up in the same way? You can forcibly mix things up, you can mix tables round, but we're back to, if it's child-led, it's just much more powerful and much more effective.
And earlier you mentioned, about getting that child having a break from the classroom, and there are children that we know struggle to be in a classroom all day. Actually, it's not a natural environment to be in a box with the fluorescent lights on all day, but there are children that struggle. But at the same time, and it's great for them, of course, but how do you, from the other end, there are those children that do comply and are very compliant and fit quite nicely into their fluorescent box. They do well in school, but actually this is huge for them because they're out of their comfort zone. Maybe they don't like getting dirty. How do you cope with those children that would rather stay in the fluorescent box?
I have to say they're very rare, or they may start out that way. We had a child start mid-year last year who came out, and at the end of her first forest school session, I asked her how she'd enjoyed it, how was forest school, and she said, I kind of liked it. I liked looking at the butterflies, but I don't like the mud. And I said, that's okay, you don't have to be near the mud, that's fine, you can go and do something else. 2 weeks later, I have a photograph of her standing knee deep in a puddle, and it has splashed up her and it's across her face. And as I walked past, I saw her and I just looked at her and said, what happened to I don't like mud? And she just shrugged and grinned at me, and that was it. It was over. Children will adapt the same way as they adapt inside to the fluorescent lights, or the majority of them do. The majority of them will adapt outside without fluorescent lights. There are one or two who, I can't even say consistently, but there's one or two who may occasionally, because obviously, like all of us, children bring their own baggage to school and to settings, who may sort of want to do something quiet. And that's part of the way forest school is set up. There are different areas, different zones, different activities, and if they just want to go and sit in a little den with a book, then they can go and sit in a den with a book. Nobody's going to judge them for it, and nobody's going to stop them. and they might do that for, you know, an hour and then go and play. They might do it for 10 minutes, they might do it for 2 or 3 weeks, but in my experience, they pretty much always come out of their shell, and start playing. At Chartham for the past few years, we have 2 satellite classes from St Nick's, which is an SEND school, and lots of those children come out with sensory issues, but they love it as well. They come out and they choose. So the ones that don't particularly like the mud don't go into the mud kitchen. They'll be in the long grass looking for bugs, and the ones that don't want to be anywhere near a bug might be trying to climb a tree. They will find something. It's because it's not just the one activity going on, that they can pick and choose and find what it is, and eventually they usually stray out of the activities they generally choose and try something different.
Yeah, push their boundaries a little bit.
Yeah.
And have you noticed, actually, based upon this, and you might not have this information, but I'm sure you have anecdotally, that when children are introduced to forest school and they start attending their regular forest school, does this have an impact on the time they spend outside of school? So at home, have you heard of sort of their want to explore and be outside increases the more they are au fait with
sometimes in fact there's a broad mixture there, because there are some children who love being outside and are very engaged and come from families that do lots of camping or lots of hiking or lots of bike rides, or they're already in the Girl Scouts or the Boy Scouts, and they're very outdoorsy children to begin with, and they love forest school because it's an extension of that. There are other children who will say, I wish I could go outside more. And when we talk about why they don't, it might literally be their housing. They might be living in a flat and they haven't got a garden. Some of them will say, I'd like to go to the park more, or I love it when I'm at Granny's because she has got a garden. And some children will just lament that, I quote, we never go outside, which I think is probably a bit of an exaggeration, even from those children. So there is a mix of it all. When we've got all the children in at Chartham, including the SEND classes, we've probably got pushing 400 children. And I can honestly say in the last 3 years, I haven't had any child who hasn't wanted to be out there. And even the ones that are used to being outdoors will say that they want to do more. I think if they're outdoors every weekend, they'd like to be outdoors every night as well. So I think, yes, they do. There is an increase in wanting to get outside and do some of the forest school activities for themselves within their own home or within their own free time.
Yeah, and I get that. I think the more you are outside, the more you want to be outside. It's a bit of a positive addiction, really, that you become much more comfortable outside, and you become more confident in varying outside spaces. Do you also see and have reported on, so you talked about how they interact outside, but have you had reports on that forest school has a positive overall impact on behaviour? So when they're back in the classroom, does their behaviour revert to how it was, or is there a sort of positive impact over time?
I think it's over time. There's definitely an improvement. I can't quote them, but there are plenty of studies. If anybody wants to Google them and have a look, there are plenty of studies on how it has helped behaviour and attendance and all different things within school. Anecdotally, I've had teachers who have said, I like it on a Tuesday when they come back inside because they'll sit down and listen. And that may literally simply be that they've got all the jitters out of their body and they're ready to sit down now. But anecdotally, that I've had teachers say to me, this one's a forest school success, was no confidence whatsoever, and when she's out here she acts totally differently, so when she comes back into the classroom she acts differently as well. And it's a way of building that confidence, but at their own pace and on their own terms. So if you come outside and you're very shy, you can sidle up to one person if you want to. You can go and explore completely solo if you want to, and you can pick and choose which group you join into. So you have the opportunity to have some control over your own social development as well as your own educational development.
Yeah, and I have heard of schools strategically placed in Forest School for certain year groups where there's poor, not so good attendance on those days, and it has had an impact. They've used it quite strategically because the children really want to come into Forest School, and it has seen a turnaround. But obviously, that's not going to be a fix, and that's not a long-term fix. We need to have children attend all the time, but I know it has been used as a strategy and a successful one. So Forest School happens all year round.
Yep.
You manage the winter months when it's wet, it's cold, it's pouring with rain.
Personally, layers is all I can say. Layers and layers and more layers. I turn up to work looking like the Michelin Man and slowly peel them off as I get hot or put them back on. As Billy Connolly says, there's no such thing as the wrong weather, just the wrong clothing. So as long as you're dressed for it, you can be outside. And the same goes for the children. We do as much reminding as we can of them and of parents to be dressed for whatever the weather, not only whatever it is, but whatever it might be. So today we had a massive downpour, but of course the children were out in it. They don't care. They're just running around in the rain, which we're lucky enough that at the moment it's still warm enough not to be too much of an issue. Once it gets colder, then they really do need they can still run around in the rain, but they're going to need hoods and coats. And it literally does boil down to the clothing. We have been outside at Chartham 2 years ago when it snowed in the February, and we had the most amazing thick sort of 3-4 inch snow everywhere, and the children were doing snow angels and snowball fights and things like that. We can adapt sessions in situations like that when it's absolutely freezing to maybe shorten them a bit, to include some group games so that the children get moving, because ultimately that's what's going to keep you warm. And you just have to pay attention to the age of the children, how quickly they're getting cold, and how quickly you can get them back inside. During cold weather, we have hot drinks out there for them as well. And everything can also lead towards them taking some responsibility. So today, when it was absolutely pouring down, there were about 4 children who were outside in t-shirts who were saying, "Oh, my coat's inside." And it was like, but why? Why is your coat on your peg? Why is your coat in your locker? Your coat should be outside because you're outside. And that's one of the strengths of Forest School, is trying to teach the children themselves some of their own responsibility, and learning how to take that responsibility and risk assess not only tree climbing, but what kind of clothing I'm going to need for whatever the weather looks like right at this moment.
Yeah, and have you had any resistance from parents, or sort of moans and groans from parents about, I don't want my child outside because it's raining, it's freezing cold?
I think since I started at Chartham, when I started, Chartham worked very differently, because the previous Forest School leader was a TA who did Forest School 3 or 4 times a week in the afternoons only, with half a class, with the other half of a class going swimming. And the children often didn't like being out there. Like, one of the first things I was told was, "Oh, be warned, they moan about it a lot because they get cold and they get wet." But I haven't actually experienced any of that. You keep them moving, you make sure that they're okay. And I think if the children aren't complaining, then a lot of the times the parents aren't worried about it either. We have, I think, probably 3 different parents in 3 years have made some kind of comment somewhere, but they are literally comments in passing. We actually, in trying to continue to deliver a large quantity of Forest School sessions a week, we had to shorten them, and at one point we tried alternating weeks for year groups and or alternating terms, and in fact what we had was parents complaining about their child not having forest school experiences. So it kind of went to the other end, rather than complaining about the children being outside, complaining the children weren't.
Yeah, that's great though, isn't it? I'd rather parents complaining that way than the other. So if teachers are listening to this and thinking, we don't have much forest school, and they're keen to establish or talk to their senior leadership about establishing a forest school, what advice would you have for them? Where to start? What to do?
I think the first thing I'd say is go and see one. We often have visitors at Chartham coming to have a look and see what's going on. The way it fits easily into a school is that we generally use forest school to cover PPA. So you're not necessarily trying to crowbar it into your curriculum. You have already have a space that it can be used for. You have to be careful not to use forest school to cover the curriculum very much. I know of schools that either want some of the science done outside or the geography covered outside, and it's not that we don't cover those things, it's just that I cannot guarantee that every child in that class will do that activity because it's child-led. So it's not easy to use it within the curriculum in that way. It can certainly reinforce the curriculum, and if you work with the teachers, you can definitely use it to back up some of the stuff that's been going on or is about to be covered. But it's fairly simple to establish forest school. There are cost implications, mainly in training somebody. If anybody's seriously thinking about having somebody trained, I would say you find somebody who is well established as a TA or a teacher, and then put them straight in for level 3. I'm not saying that level 1 or level 2 are not worthwhile, but a lot of what you will learn during that period of time is stuff that has been covered either by experience or by your degree or any training you've already had. Those levels are really there for somebody who has no experience of working with children at all. And I have seen forest schools set up in a corner of a concrete playground. I've seen them set up on the corner of a playing field without any trees whatsoever, in a piece of woodland across the road, in the corner of a park. There are lots of different ways of delivering it, because as long as you stick to the ethos of it really being child-led and being outside, you are going to cover most of what you want to achieve.
So the key thing is establishing the time, i.e. how are you going to, what time are you going to give the children to do it? Is it going to be a cover PPA kind of thing, or is there something else? And to get your staff trained are key, and to go in, if you are already teacher trained or an experienced TA, into your level 3 training.
Yes.
And then to find a space. And that was sort of my next sort of what I was going to say is, but what if you haven't got any space? And you've kind of said it's doable anywhere, and forest school doesn't necessarily clearly need to be in a forest. But have you got any examples of some really innovative setting up a forest school where there is limited space?
I think the most innovative one I ever saw was when I did my training. We went to visit quite a few settings, and one of the settings we visited was a day nursery that was set up in a large house. So it had a good 100-foot garden out the back, and the back end of it was patio. And what they did is they brought in huge planters, and they planted fast growing things like bamboo. And they put wood chips down across the whole of this patio area, and they created space for the children to explore, where they could find bugs, where they could watch things grow, where they couldn't climb trees because there were no mature established trees, but they could balance on logs that had been cut down. And there are all different ways of delivering forest schools. So we currently at Chartham, we have just started 3 forest schools. Technically, we're being a bit greedy. We're lucky enough to have a very large site because the school building was originally a secondary school, and therefore we have set up 3 separate base camps, which is the circle of logs where classes start and finish. And so we have one in the wildlife garden, which is very much like the school garden. We have one which is set solely underneath some quite dense mature trees. And we have the one that I've been using and developing over the last few years, which is in a small copse on the edge of a playing field. They lend themselves to 3 totally different kinds of forest school, although the ethos at the bottom of it remains the same. So within the school garden, there is a pond where the children can do pond dipping. There are raised beds next door where they can do planting. There's a chance for flowers. There's a mud kitchen at the back. And then you kind of shift round to being under the trees, where we've put up slack lines and we've got tires hanging and swings hanging, and it's a much more physical kind of jungle gym kind of place. And then when you come back over to where I am, I think their favorite thing is digging. They love the dig pit and they'll dig all the time. We have every single one of these 3. We offer the same. We all offer bug hunting, we all offer bird spotting, we all offer many of the same activities, but we are able to focus on different things. So you will find that every forest school is a little bit different, partly because of the environment, partly because of whoever it is that is leading forest school will bring their own strengths to it. And it can be done. We had 18 students last school year training with us to be forest school leaders, and they've all gone off to vastly different sites. Some of them are literally jumping on a bus and going to a corner of Blean Woods, and we'll be delivering it there. So there's usually a way to do it. At Charlton, we're hoping to be able to offer space to local schools if they want to come to us and use some of the space. But also, again, if you are a school that want to use it and you know a school down the road that's got one, then make links with them and see if your forest school leader can walk a group of children down the road and use their site when they're not using it. There are many ways around it if you try hard enough.
So be creative. It can happen anywhere.
Yeah.
Find a corner. If in doubt, find a corner of a playground and transform it somehow.
Yeah, just is always, if there's a starting point, and actually if you reach out, we'll always give as much advice as we can, but you'll find whoever your local forest school leader is will help you out. And actually, when you do your forest school leader training, a lot of that will be covered and you will be given the information and the skills to make the most of whatever space you've got.
So there's no reason to not have a forest school at all. So I look forward to hearing from, it'd be great, wouldn't it, if someone's listening to this and they go away and go, I didn't think we could have one, but now I'm convinced we have, and now I'm off on a mission to set up the forest school. So to finish off, Jo, though, it's been great. I just love the concept. I think it's so important. And I do hope you've inspired people to really push forward with some, even just the start of setting up forest school, even if it's to think from this, I'm going to go and visit a couple. I'm going to look at where there's some local forest schools in my area, and I'm going to go and approach them just to have a look. That's the first step.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
That would be an absolute win, and maybe something, if you're listening, that you can challenge yourself to. So to finish off, and I do this with all of our podcast guests, is go back to you. We started about what you've done, and the last couple of questions are really about a reflection and a looking forward. So these are quite big questions. So What's been your greatest achievement to date in your career?
It's difficult to tell, I guess. I think, and it's an achievement. When COVID hit, lots of schools shut down their forest school, and everything just got scaled back. And at the time, although I was working in the outskirts of Canterbury, I was living in London. So I was one of the first people that was told, you don't have to come in. You don't have to do that journey every day. And I just said, no, I have to, because being outside is the best place for everybody at the moment. And as I said, when I first took the job, we were doing 3 or 4 afternoons a week with half a class. And over COVID, we ended up with 16 bubbles. And I work a 4-day week, and we managed to get all 16 bubbles in the 4 days, just doing constant back-to-back forest school for the children, because they needed to be outside. And it was really easy to see that they needed to be outside when you're actually worried about a pandemic and literal germs floating around. But children need to be outside anyway. Humans need to be outside. So that didn't really stop when lockdown stopped. So as a school, we continued doing it. Sometimes I'm not sure if it was the best thing I did or the worst thing I did, because I went from a nice, easy schedule to the mania of trying to get 16 classes through in 4 days. And we tried every different way we could to do it. As I said, we had one year one term, and the other year one the following term. And we tried to timetable it in so many different ways so that we could have the children outside for a substantial amount of time, which is important for forest school. And then we made the decision to train 2 more people. And therefore, starting literally this week, we have all 3 forest schools up and running, which means I'm finally down to just the 6 at the moment forest schools a week. But we have both year ones out at the same time, so that the teachers' PPA can be together, but one class is with me, one class is at a different base camp. And so across the week, every class will be getting 2 weeks forest school for the whole year. And that kind of is an achievement as well in itself, to actually manage to get that up and running. I didn't do it solely on my own. It has definitely been teamwork, but it does feel like, oh, we've finally got somewhere. And I would like to revel in it a bit, but I can't, because you come back to school and your feet touch, and now we're doing it. So now we're just trying to troubleshoot and see how well it's actually going to work in practice, seeing as it works so beautifully on paper.
It sounds great, and certainly at COVID time, it would have been, I'm sure, for those children, a hugely appreciated time outside. And just before I move on to my last question, something else popped in my head. Cost for training. If you're going to go in at level 3, what kind of, not necessarily exact, what kind of ballpark are you sort of looking at for training? School budgets are tight.
In all honesty, it does vary, but I will estimate it at being the best part of £1,000 for somebody to be a level 3 forest school leader. At the risk of a plug, we do host with FSLI, who trained me, and I will admit I do work for them as an assessor when they train people in our area. They stripped it right back, because when you do your training, there are additional add-ons which you can or you don't necessarily have to have. If you're going to run a Saturday forest school for people to drop their children off at, you may well also do outdoor first aid, so that you know how to make a stretcher out of jumpers if somebody breaks a leg and you're in the middle of Blean Woods. You may also do some city and guilds and health and safety work for being able to cook a lunch safely outdoors. But when it comes to schools, often those things, it's not that they're not needed, they're always good to know. But from a school's point of view, you're never going to ask your forest school leader to cook a meal outside. And if a child is injured, they're on school grounds, they're going to remain on school grounds until an ambulance arrives. So they strip it back to offering literally just the Forest School Leader course, which is, I think, currently just under £800 plus VAT. But obviously, as a school, you can claim the VAT back. So you can find them for that kind of price, depending on exactly what it is you would like to do. And you're still able to do some cooking outside with the children. From our point of view, all three of the staff that are qualified, I personally have done outdoor first aid in the past, but the last 2 times it's been renewed, I've just stuck with paediatric first aid, because if a child falls out of a tree, I'm just waiting for the ambulance. It is that simple. I'm not in the middle of nowhere where I need to get somewhere where I've got phone reception.
Great. And what we'll do is, in the episode notes, we'll put the link to the FSLI, so some people have got a starting point to go and do their research. And then my last question for you then, and this is a biggie, and is there an ambition you hold and still hope to achieve in your career?
I don't know if I have personal ambition. I would love to see, like you were saying, Forest School I'd like to see it in all schools. I'd like to see it go through to secondary. It doesn't just stop the moment you walk into year 7. If nothing else, I'd like to see some year 7s invited back to their schools for part of transition, still being able to do Forest School for a while, whether it's just for 1 term or for the summer term or whatever. We've also got coming up the new Gcse in natural history that is going to be rolled out, which I assume is going to be optional as to whether a school offers it. And that's going to be really difficult for secondary schools to roll out if they are concrete jungles. Yes, you can do it, I'm sure, by watching YouTube and by having great PowerPoints. But ultimately, what you're really going to need to do some kind of bio blitz is some time on grass. And I'd like to see Forest schools that are in primaries being able to link up with secondaries to offer support in order to be able to do that, and to use their sites and to use their skills to say, well, you come here for an afternoon a week and do the practical side of everything locally. There will be lots of environmental centres, and the Wildlife Trust, I'm sure, will be able to open their doors. But sometimes it's easier to just, go 3 streets away to the primary school around the corner than it is to get everybody on a coach and head off into the heart of a forest somewhere. So I would like to see more Forest School in Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4, just working its way up. And I think there's nothing but benefits that are available through doing it. I can't see anything that's going to make it detrimental in any shape or form.
Yeah, brilliant. That's a fantastic aspiration that you hold, and I do hope that more and more schools do consider how, even at small scale, they can embed this onto their site, but B into their busy curriculum that has no space. So thank you so much. It's been inspiring. I'm sure people listening are inspired to get involved in Forest School, or at least explore their options. And you can follow Chartham Forest School on Twitter, and it's at Chartham Forest, and I will put the link into our episode notes as well, so you can see what Jo and the children are up to in their 3 different forest schools. Not to brag, 3 different forest schools. Thank you so much, Jo, for sharing your expertise with us. It's been fascinating.
You're more than welcome.